slama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljoradnih ljudi. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, Tita. самых окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Слава и ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как невесту родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the 28th of February 2024 in the evening time. Of course, 22:30, our start time here. And good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning to you wherever you are. And we are live today on YouTube and Odyssey and Rumble, as always. And I will, of course, open up by doing some greetings to those who are in the chat. And then we will proceed with the business at hand. So, first of all, let's say hello. And we have got with us this evening in the chat, we've got Elisa and James Graham and Red Star Betty and Jay, who's settling in with a well-balanced ale. Well, my take on the CPUSA will be not favourable, but hang around for that. And good evening to C. Bolt, Luca, and Dan Lindstrom, who joins us from Sweden. Good evening to Todd, who joins us, I believe, from New Mexico. Fenrir, good evening to you. Mark S., who says, greetings from Chicago. I am an ex-trot anarchist. Well, you're not alone in that. I had my anarchism phase as well. I will talk about it more at some point if there's a demand for it. Looking for a Marxist-Leninist party in the States, but finding nothing but more trots or bullshit faux communists. Any ideas? Thanks for your time. Well, I'm sure American comrades in the chat can make some suggestions for you. I've yet to read through the full program of the Party of Communists USA, but there's some very positive stuff in there. I've got my disagreements with it, but perhaps that might be a place to start. But Americans are probably more equipped to answer that question than I am. Muzzle Paint, Solidarity. Good evening to my comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project. And if you haven't read the latest Class Consciousness Project article, I will now post it into the chat. It is, of course, about how capitalism kills great sporting institutions. And that's with reference to the Football Association Cup, of course. And Wolf Tone, who is with us and says something that I cannot pronounce at all in Irish. Fenrir asks, what are my thoughts concerning Hinkle has and the MAGA communism thing? I've seen things that Hinkle has said that seem ludicrous, but I will confess I can't reach a full and proper judgment on him. Even though I've seen plenty of things which he is reported to have said, which I find, as I say, ridiculous, but I have not watched very much at all of his show, so I'll say that first of all. So it's important for me to say that I can't reach a full and proper judgment on what he's said or reported to have said without doing further research into his program. I've watched a couple of things that he's done. I've read the extended blog post he did about MAGA communism. There was an awful lot in there that I didn't agree with. But, you know, if it annoys the right people, there is something to be said for it. But I find the formulation of MAGA communism to be opportunistic, to be blunt. I know what the likes of Has are trying to do, but there are people in Britain who are trying to do similar things, and what it leads to, unfortunately, is a lot of opportunism. I'm happy to go more into that if people want to demand it. President Jesus, hello to you out there in the dictatorship of Gavin Newsom. Jeremy Turner says, I want to know Alex's take on the RCP in the US, which has claimed for years to be Marxist-Leninist anti-trot, and which seems to be the only group in the US that takes that stand. Us, Revolutionary Communist Party in the US, I've got to be honest with you, I've not heard of it. I can look it up and get back to you, Jeremy, but I'm not going to speculate on what this might be. There's another group calling themselves the Revolutionary Communists in the United States who are trots. Don't know whether they're the same group or whether they're a different group. Greetings to CJ out there in rural Virginia who's about to drive home. We've got Jenny who joins us and says, good evening, comrades. Good evening to my comrade Ian Foster. Glad that Jenny was enjoying Warsawianka. Bernarda Bender says, morning to all comrades from the British Dominion of Queensland, Australia. Battle Cossack has apparently been watching a lot of Chinese cinema. And with that in mind, be sure to join us on Patreon for the RoboCop review on Saturday of this week. I may make it a mega review, and I may go for, if I can fit the time, I can find the time to watch all three of the originals and the very bad 2012 remake. That might be an interesting extended video essay, should we say. Dan Lindstrom, who says, just home from a Palestine meeting in Stockholm, not only open for us Stalinists. Every Saturday the demonstration will grow and grow. Fake communists and social chauvinists will join. Are you saying it wasn't open, the meeting wasn't open for quote-unquote Stalinists, Dan? If you could clarify your comment there, please. Raziel, good evening to you. Kent, good afternoon. Steve Sweeney, good to have you with us here, comrade, who joins us from Moscow. And Lee, good evening to you. Lertis, brotherly greetings back to you. HM, who says, I'm raising a glass to the failure of the private moon landing. They still can't do what the Soviets did 60 years ago. Oh, the privatized moon landing failed, did it? Well, they'll probably get another bailout from the American government. Fish Biscuits, good evening to you. And Ziras Demori, hello. And Carlos, good afternoon to you out there in Nicaragua. Shawnika McAdams, who waves or claps, I'm not sure, but I wave back to you. Hello to Yuan out there in Phoenix, Arizona, and Clinton Frazier, greetings to you. Would South of England ever be red? Yes, without doubt. Look, the South of England gets this reputation from certain leftists as being this like uniform reactionary place. The truth be told, it's, of course, the area where consistently the Conservative Party has its strongest voting base. But there's some very solid a lot of very solid working class areas all the way across London and the South East. There's revolutionary legacies in a lot of these counties that like Social Democrats write off as hopelessly reactionary, like Essex, like the long history of struggle of, for instance, the Kent miners. There's a long histories of struggle in a lot of these South Coast towns that, again, the left writes off as hopelessly reactionary. So, of course, it'll go red. Where there is a working class, eventually it will go red. But it just won't be red in the sense of social democracy or the Labour Party, comrade. Right, where are we now? Can I explain opportunism with some current examples? Well, that's what we're here tonight to do, Fish Biscuits. Right. Hinkle called himself a Stalinist. He is a populist YouTuber and MAGA communist for good evil. Is he calling himself a Stalinist now? Okay. All right. Well, I haven't seen that. Jenny says, these newer updates to YouTube app are atrocious. It's pretty much unusable. It'll go for a bit, then start lagging badly in the chat. I have to close, reopen, and over again. Anyone else? Okay. Well, let me know if it would be better if I started doing this program just on maybe focusing more on the Rumble side of things. I don't know. Okay, so... Well, we've got Labour Party reactionaries up here. I mean, you look at like the way the Labour Party behave in local government, like it's no different to the way the Tories behave. The Labour councillors that I have encountered in the Northwest behave no differently to Tory councillors. If anything, they're even more corrupt and even worse people on a personal level and just as bad on a political level. One thing I would appeal to everybody to do is, and this is understandable, and I'm not having a go here, is that we're all in Britain anyway, and it's the same in the United States with the Democrats and Republicans. You're brought up to imagine that on some level the Labour Party is better than the Conservative Party, just as Americans are brought up to regard the Democrats as somehow more tolerable than the Republicans. Now, what you have to move beyond that as a communist, and you have to understand the role that the Labour Party plays, which is that it is the left face of the bourgeoisie, and it has been for 100 years. And before that, it was a party mainly of the Labour aristocracy, and of course the trade union bureaucracy. And even though, of course, the Tories are vile and disgusting, the Labour Party are equally as vile and disgusting. A lot of working class people in Britain know it, which is why they won't vote for the Labour Party. They might not vote for the Tories either. They might just not vote at all, especially at the local level. But we have to get over this idea that the Labour Party is now or was ever that much better than the Conservatives. And I will give you just an example to think about, which is that the programme the Labour Party enacted from 45 to 51, which saved British capitalism, let's be clear about that, by making concessions and, of course, increasing the rate of exploitation of the colonised peoples. That programme, other than the nationalisation of steel And I believe the way that they handled Imperial Chemical Industries, I need to confirm on that, but certainly the nationalisation of steel was the biggest thing that the Tories overturned. Everything else they accepted. Stuff like the health service, they didn't want to accept it, but they had to because it was a necessary part of retaining British capitalism and making sure that the working class got pacified by reforms. So every single thing, other than steel nationalisation, that the Labour Party did from 45 to 51, the Tories accepted. And every single thing the Tories did from 79 to 97, the Labour Party accepted. And so it goes on. Keir Starmer will accept everything that the Tories have done. He'll just put another face on it. And so we must stop falling into this trap. And I say this as somebody who did fall into it for quite some time. There was ever a point when the Labour Party was better. They've always been a ruling class party. They've always been the left face of the bourgeoisie. Let's go earlier. Let's go to their first time in office in the 1920s. Check their record then. It really wasn't that much different to the prior government, the national governments led by Lloyd George, or the governments that came immediately after them, led by Stanley Baldwin. There's a reason why Ramsay MacDonald could easily go into a national government coalition in 1931 with Stanley Baldwin and Lloyd George and many of the others. It's because this is the way it has always been. It has always been the left face of the bourgeoisie and will only do what the bourgeoisie is prepared to accept, except in extremis when it is compelled to do more to preserve capitalism. And in that case, the Tories, as the designated party of the ruling class, the first 11, shall we say, accepted most 90%, 95% of those reforms the Tories accepted. It's rather elongated digression there, but I hope you get the point. Right, okay. Good evening to Peter, my fellow resident of perfidious Albion. Clinton asks, what's my thoughts on capitalist realism and Mark Fisher? That will take quite a long time, Clinton, so hold on to your question, and I think what we need to do with a lot of these is put them into a proper Q&A session. Hello to Tusker, who's joined us. Sean Eakin McAdam says, please speak more on MAGA communists. Well, I think I need to put that into a Q&A as well. Happy to do so. PSL is running candidates, says Potted Rodent. Well, they can certainly run them, but I think the PSL's thing is basically like they're a more militant version of the DSA, and they'll also default back to the Democrats when the pressure gets on them. What does chauvinism mean exactly? Well, I'll come to explain it, Luca, when we talk about the subject at hand. Have I done an episode on El Salvador Bukele? I haven't, but I'm happy to take it up in the future. Potted Rodent says, are you all referring to the CPUSA? Their teeth was pulled in the 70s. They support Democrats. That's true. Good evening to Marius, who's joined us. Burke, good evening to you. And basic question, says HM. We were the lumpen proletariat and are they a lost cause in terms of revolutionary potential? Well, they're not a lost cause. I mean, Marx identified them as those who were on the lower end, well, basically the very lowest part of the proletariat, those who are either not in work at all, the permanently unemployed, or those engaged in criminal or semi-criminal occupations. That's how he defines it in the manifesto. They're not a lost cause, I would say. Marx says in the manifesto that they are prone to being swept along by reaction. And if you look at like the history of fascist movements, one of the classes that they recruit from first is either ruined petty bourgeois or the lumpenized elements of the working class, i.e. those without regular employment, those who have fallen below the poverty line, those who have fallen into criminality. That's who the lumpen are. It's not correct to just write them off because they can become parts of the revolutionary movement. If the proletariat builds a strong organization, the lumpen can get swept along into it and carried along, and of course increase their level of class consciousness as a result. The mistake that some people have made over the years is that they have sought to base revolutionary organizations on the lumpen, which you can't do, because they're an unstable class by their very nature, because they're outside of the regular economy. They're outside of regular workplaces. They're prone to volatility in terms of their consciousness and their behavior, and that's been proved over and over again. And often they're used against the working class, like criminal gangs are used against the working class by the ruling class to create fear and terror in working class communities. And that's the kind of thing that Marx is referring to when he makes those points about the lumpen in the manifesto. I hope that makes it a little bit clearer. Tusker says PCUSA is, as far as I know, the only Stalinist party in the United States. Ian Foster says PCUSA and CPIUSA are both signed up to the anti-imperialist platform. No other US signatories, although CPI are not a party, only CPGBML from Britain has. Those not signed up, can they be trusted? Well, in the case of Britain, definitely not. Polina Vasilyev, curious as to what sources you base your comments about PSL on. Comments from PSL members, Polina, especially at the last election. Marius says PSL's campaign is even more of a joke than Cornel West, and that is really saying something. Right, good evening to Martin, who's joined us. Right, okay. I'm going to get on with the question at hand here. Now, for those who aren't aware of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm just going to post the relevant material here so you can see it. The first thing I'm going to be talking about is the statement of policy from the Communist Party of Britain on the Ukraine war. Now, you may ask, why bother talking about an organisation that is essentially, it's not dead, but it's like dead in the water. Now, it has about, depending upon which sources you believe, 700 to 800 members. It's the remnant of the old Communist Party of Great Britain that crashed and destroyed itself under the influence of Euro-communism at the end of the 1980s. So the question is like, well, why deal with this at all? The unfortunate thing is, and this is true of the CPUSA, I think, to an extent as well, this party, which still has the legacy of the old, much more established and much more heroic in terms of its history party, the CPGB. This party, which carries the residue of that legacy, has a lot of the legal rights to the buildings and the works associated with that legacy, and also occupies a very key position inside the trade unions in Britain. The CPB, through its associated newspaper, the Morning Star, has a very strong presence in the trade union bureaucracy in Britain. And so, therefore, they are as close to an official communist party as you can find in this country. So, unfortunately, they've still got an influence. They've got a lot of members in academia. They had one member was on, one of their members was actually on the government scientific advisory group, I believe, over COVID, and actually ran into trouble with some of the rightists who started objecting to it, saying, claiming that the whole thing was a communist plot. So these are people in trade union roles, leading trade union roles, in very influential academic roles, in various other parts of the labour aristocracy that gives them a degree of influence, which unfortunately means that their words do carry weight, and therefore we have to take them seriously. As you can see from this piece of writing, no, you shouldn't take them too seriously. And they tie themselves up in knots in this. Now, again, I want to examine this because I think it reveals all the confusion and opportunism of not just the CPB, but this statement could easily have been written by a Trotskyite outfit as well. So let's get into this. Opening sentence, and they immediately contradict themselves. So I'll read this for the benefit of the record. Today, reads the statement, marks the second anniversary of Russia's brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, an invasion which was provoked by decades of NATO expansionism and provocations. Now, straight away, if you can't see the contradiction there between the first part of the sentence and the second part, then, well, I don't know what to say to you. So, on the one hand, the communists, the fake communists here, claim that Russia's invasion is brutal and unjustified. Then, in the second part of the sentence, they say how it was justified. So, and also with reference to its brutality, yes, there's no doubt that this war is a horrendously brutal thing, which has killed at least 500,000 Ukrainians, and, well, depending upon which casualty count you use, the around about 50-odd thousand Russians. But in terms of brutality, okay, war is a brutal business, and the Russians have set themselves the Clausewitzian task of annihilating the fighting capacity of the enemy. And, of course, NATO seeks to prolong it as far as it possibly can. So the fact that they're saying it's unjustified, and the fact that they're saying it's brutal, I mean, you want to see real brutality towards the civilian population, look to Gaza right now. But then saying it was provoked by decades of NATO expansionism. So, well, take a side here. What are you saying? So you can tell that within even their leadership group, there are two trends at work all the way through this statement. There's the trend which clearly is better and wants to say that this war is an imperialist war on the part of US imperialism, and the Russian action is justified in terms of self-defense. But there's another section, clearly, which is the section which is probably more aligned to the upper end of the trade union bureaucracy and the Labour Party, because, of course, one of the things that the Communist Party of Britain does is it basically tells people to vote for the Labour Party at every election, and has done for decades. So they clearly are in the midst of an argument amongst themselves, and this is why they're coming up with statements that make absolutely no sense. Then they say that the USA, the UK, the EU, well, the EU is Germany and France and Italy, basically, and NATO, well, again, like, this is it's a small thing, but I have a objection to, like, putting these organisations down as if they have an independent existence. The EU represents the will of the capitalist classes of principally France, Germany, Italy, to a certain extent also the Netherlands, which, even though it's a relatively small country, plays still a very important role in terms of it being an imperialist power. And to a certain extent Spain, though not as much. So the EU does not have an independent existence. Doesn't have an army. All of its attempts to turn itself into a superstate will absolutely fail. NATO doesn't have an independent existence either. NATO is principally the United States, US imperialism. To a certain extent British imperialism, but militarily and industrially, nowhere near as important. Without the US, there is no NATO. So really, you should just cut this out and say US imperialism and its associated bloc allies. Right. The Communist Party, so they say, has been very clear in our position since the beginning of the war. Well, you've just been very unclear in the opening statement. But they say we continue to call for an immediate ceasefire and a negotiated peace. Okay. The immediate ceasefire they were calling for initially was, and they seem to have removed this from their latest statement because they got absolutely fucking monstered about it, was that they were calling for the immediate withdrawal of Russian forces. Now, I think that statement is still on their website somewhere, though they have, of course, removed it from this particular iteration of it. Now, let's be clear that what the immediate withdrawal of Russian forces would mean. It would be a one-sided withdrawal, because for all that the Communist Party of Britain calls for an immediate ceasefire, if the Russians were to withdraw, you can bet that the US imperialists would not be withdrawing their forces or be instructing their agents within the Ukrainian forces to actually withdraw their withdraw themselves. If the Russians were to withdraw, as the CPB has previously demanded, then what would happen would be an immediate full-scale invasion again, if the Ukrainians still had the capacity to do so, of the Donbass certainly, and the other areas which are now part of Russia. So that's what the so-called communists were calling for in the early part of the war, which is the one-sided withdrawal of Russian forces. And that put them, of course, fully in line, not just with the British government, but also with the US imperialists and, of course, the Banderists in Ukraine. So, now here we get to another statement which is fundamentally ridiculous. This is about halfway down the first page. They say, the war between Russia and Ukraine is part of a wider conflict between capitalist powers, between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the expansionist NATO powers on the other. Neither side in this war stands for the real interests of the peoples of Russia, Ukraine, or of Europe more widely. This is fundamentally a statement that is pro-imperialist, and also fundamentally it's Trotskyite in its politics. And I say this because, and we've covered this many times on the program, that you cannot just dismiss the Russia of today as being the analog of US imperialism. They are not the same. Russia, albeit it is a capitalist country, as we've covered many times before, and you can go back into the archive and look for this, it is a non-imperialist country. There's a couple of episodes I've done on that in response to an article by Paulette Sturm. So to dismiss this as just conflicts between capitalist powers over resources is not correct. They make another fundamentally stupid statement in the next line, and I'll quote again as follows. Russian President Putin represents the interests of a section of the country's big business oligarchy that profited from the theft of that country's economic assets from the Russian working class. Now, that is inaccurate. And again, I've covered this on many different videos, so I'm not going to reiterate too much now. But those who benefited the most from the systematic destruction of Russian industry, economy, and society in the 1990s, those people are largely out of power now. These were the ones who were behind the Yeltsin clique, and they were the ones who have never accepted Putin's presidency. They were the ones behind the attempt to remove him and replace him by the oligarch Khodorkovsky. They are the ones who are staffing the so-called Russian government in exile that the US State Department's trying to float around at the moment. So the CPB is stating something which is fundamentally inaccurate there. They are misrepresenting the nature of the Putin system. And I think that some of the people in the hierarchy of the CPB must be smart enough and well-read enough to know that they're misrepresenting this. And also, the CPB, as far as I know, and I know Steve Sweeney is with us in the chat tonight, so I don't know if he can confirm this, because he has some knowledge of both ends of this, so to speak. The CPB used to have a relationship with the KPRF, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And so they should know that the KPRF, and not just them, the Russian Communist Workers' Party and the Workers' Party of Russia, I believe it's called, the Popov Group, or the three biggest communist organizations in Russia, all were calling for the launch of a special military operation from this time, around about this time, 10 years ago. As soon as the Maidan took place and what was called the Russian Spring took place in Crimea, and the uprisings against the Banderite regime began in Donbass, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and I believe the Russian Communist Workers' Party, certainly both of them, were calling for the launch of a Russian military operation on the basis of defending the people of Donbass from the Banderite regime. And it was the motions introduced into the Duma by the KPRF that actually compelled the Russian government, finally under the pressure of imperialism, to actually first of all recognize the independence of the two Donbass republics, and that of course led to the launch of the SMO. So the Communist Party of Britain is ignoring all of the major communist organizations in Russia and is ignoring the correct analysis that they have put forward of the nature of the special military operation and the very extensive writing that both the KPRF and the RCWP have done. Now, the RCWP especially are absolutely no fans of Putin, but they have reached a correct conclusion in that as far as Putin and the Russian government stands to defend Russian sovereignty against attempts to crush Russia and dismember it, which the imperialists are absolutely open about their desire to do, and also to defend those people of the Donbass, then the special military operation needs to be backed. And they both, all the major communist organizations in Russia have analyzed this correctly and have actually done a proper materialist and dialectical analysis of the nature of the Russian government, the nature of the SMO, and there are some differences between the different communist parties in Russia with regard to the relationship with the Putin-led government, but they all agree on the fact that this is a defensive operation against an imperialist assault. The CPB ignore all of that and just go for this idea that, well, Putin represents the worst elements of the Russian ruling class, the most parasitic elements. And the truth is he does not. If he did, then he would never have launched the SMO in the first place, because it was those people, it was the capitalist class of Russia themselves, though both the open compradors and even those who are hidden compradors, shall we say, desperately didn't want this to happen. It's part of the reason why it took 10 years. So the CPB is just straight up lying there. So they then go on to talk, but they mention some things which are true, and that they say that the Zelensky has banned the Ukrainian Communist Party. That's true. They've threatened to imprison Petro Simonenko, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party. Ukrainian Communist Party, by the way, its leaders certainly, have declared in favour of the special military operation. The CPB again ignores that. So they then go on to state, like a pile of pacifist garbage, saying that the objective should be a demilitarised and neutral Ukraine. Well, are the imperialists ever going to agree to that? No, they're absolutely not. And the British government should be using its permanent membership of the UN Security Council to work to this end alongside China. Well, how's that fit with the CPB's endorsement of the Labour Party? The Labour Party under Keir Starmer, and it would be under any leader, are rabidly in favour of continuing the war in Ukraine, of continuing to arm the Ukrainian forces and use Ukrainian workers as essentially bullet stoppers on behalf of British imperialism. So what is this sort of pacifist fantasy that the CPB is putting forward? It's they're making demands of that will never be fulfilled. That's it, and they're instructing their members and their readers of their newspaper to go out and vote for a party in the form of the Labour Party in the election coming up this year, who will continue all of this and will not go along with the demand, the rather pacifist demand that they put forward. So this doesn't make any sense. It contradicts itself completely, and it puts forward positions which are quite simply 100% wrong. And not only are they wrong, I think that some of the people who wrote this must know that they are wrong. They don't reference at all like anything from like the Russian side of things, anything that the major communist parties in Russia say. And that's because if they did reference that, then they'd be undermining the case that they're trying to build there. So what you have there is a thoroughly opportunist, dishonest position, and I think that it is taken under the influence of those elements within the Communist Party of Britain who are essentially right-wing social democrats who still like to retain a Communist Party card, but are about as communist as Keir Starmer himself. And I would say, because I know some people who have been in the Communist Party of Britain. I've met a greater number over the years, and I'm in contact with some who regard themselves as anti-revisionists, who regard themselves as communists in the truest sense of the word, who would wear the label Stalinist quite proudly. And if any of them are watching, I would simply ask this: why are you still a member of this thing? What is the purpose of it? What is the point? This organization, which is meant to be the continuity organization to the old party, has been spending the last decade progressively getting worse. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, there were members of the Communist Party of Britain who were actually taking the correct position on the risings against the fascists in Ukraine, the risings in Donbass, the Russian Spring in Crimea. And I was on the wrong side of the arguments back then, because I was a Trotskyite back then, arguing what I was arguing then, what the Communist Party of Britain's leaders are arguing now, that this was an inter-imperialist struggle between two imperialist powers, the USA and the Russians, and they were all as bad as each other. So in the previous 10 years, the Communist Party of Britain and its leadership managed to get more pro-imperialist and managed to get much worse, whereas thankfully some of us at least managed to educate ourselves a little bit. So again, I would ask anybody who's still a member of this thing, why? If you consider yourself to be a Marxist-Leninist, if you consider yourself to be somebody who holds with the revolutionary legacy of Lenin and Stalin and Mao, then why on earth are you a member of this thing? What is it doing? What is it doing that the Labour Party isn't doing? Why be a member of something which spends all its time covering for the Labour Party and covering for the sellouts of the trade union bureaucracy and not taking the working class forward at all? Its programme and its analysis of imperialism are garbage. Its analysis of the war on Gaza, for instance, is pacifistic drivel. It basically makes the same case that the Labour left does. It will never say victory to the resistance. It will never make the case that, by the way, the Chinese government has now made at the International Court of Justice about simply the Chinese legal representative went forward and read out your old UN resolutions from the 80s about the rights of armed resistance, and they were passed with reference to Namibia and Palestine. So they won't even go so far as to say that. And that is because it's clear that that party is dominated by the very reactionary elements within the trade union bureaucracy, very reactionary elements in its leadership that might hold a Communist Party card, but are as utterly reactionary, pro-imperialist, and quite frankly, social chauvinist as anybody in the Labour Party is. Now, Luca referred to a question earlier, posed a question earlier, I should say, about what chauvinism is. Chauvinism, social chauvinism, is the term used by Lenin in his criticisms of the Second International, which is socialism in words, chauvinism in deeds. And it referred to the Second International, of course, and its members in Germany and France and Britain, who all voted for or endorsed the war policies of, quote unquote, their bourgeoisie. Meaning that though they continued to speak the language of socialism, they had become defenders of imperialism and defenders of rabid bourgeois nationalism in practice. They had become not internationalists, but chauvinists. That's what it refers to. A chauvinist being somebody who, a social chauvinist being somebody who talks in left language and talks in pro-worker language, but backs up the imperialist policies of the ruling class in their particular country. And if you look at the actions of the Labour Party in the country I'm in now, you can see that the Labour Party has had many people on its front bench and in its and on its back benches and in its council chambers who are every bit as racist as the Tory party members are, every bit as pro-imperialist, every bit as pro-war, and every bit as anti-communist as anybody in the Tory or the Liberal parties. So that's what the term chauvinist is referring to there. Okay, so that brings us to the end of point one. I'm going to pause and take a few questions because I think we've had a few contributions. Wolf Tone says, CPB claims that the Russian invasions was unjustified but also admits it was provoked. Yep. Proud high school dropout working class over here, says Cobra Commander. Well, there's a lot of people out there who are high school dropouts who are just as clever as anybody with 8 degrees to their names. Level of education has nothing to do with intelligence. Hello to Slava, who's joined us, and Klavek, who's joined us. Jason says, Susan Michie is the professor you referred to. That's the Communist Party member who was involved in the government's COVID plans. She banged on relentlessly about zero COVID, then blocked me on Twitter for pointing out that she was the daughter of a baroness. A real part of genuine Labour aristocracy there, Jason. You know, not a surprise at all, really. Steve says, CPB claim to follow the line of its sister parties, except when these parties say something they disagree with, e.g. the KPRF and its statement on the eve of the SMO calling for united anti-fascist front, I believe you want to say there. Yeah. Jenny says, cowards talking out of both sides of their mouths. That's true. Mark says, make America great again, a Trump message, faux communists looking to have real communists, actually fascists, just like Nazism left wing. Okay, I think I get what you mean there. Communists is serving imperialism, says Ian Foster, but the communist is in inverted commas, of course. Marius says, none of these opportunists can ever say what they would do if they were in Putin's position, besides just allowing Russia to be completely encircled by NATO. I think the reason why they can't say what they would do is because, fundamentally, because the fake communists in Britain are dominated by social democrats and social chauvinists. Many of these people actually agree with the objectives of the bourgeoisie, and many of them actually do agree with the idea of breaking up Russia and dismembering it and allowing British imperialism to rape it and loot its resources. Because fundamentally, these people, to go back to the social chauvinist point of view, they see, quite correctly in some respects, the possibility of reform for their particular bit of the Labour aristocracy if British imperialism increases dramatically its profits. That's the way that many of the Social Democrats in the Labour Party over the years have conducted themselves. They know very well that they think they know that if they can get British imperialism's profit margins increased, it might mean more reforms for their chosen bit of the working class. They are drastically and wholly wrong, and they are also politically repulsive. HM, what happens to liberals during a revolutionary process? Are they permanent wreckers? Well, many liberals can become revolutionaries under the influence of a revolutionary process, HM. Some become communists, others become fascists. That's what happened in the Russian Revolution, certainly, and it'll happen now in ours too. Steve says, it's rank opportunism and indistinguishable from the line of the Labour Party, the Trots, the government, etc. And it seems to have hidden the Russian troops outline, which then Stop the War support. Yes, they do. Stop the War, by the way, if you don't know, is the British organisation, which is apparently an anti-war organisation, though, of course, spent much of the last decade being in favour of wars on Libya, certainly, and also Syria. Fenrir says, between Macron's statements and Euro leaders and the mainstream media, it's the festival of incoherence and dissonance. Well, Macron threw a temper tantrum, essentially. And I think it comes down to the fact that French imperialism is losing its neo-colonies in West Africa. And many of the French ruling class and their politicians blame the Russians for this, even though the Russians were only tangentially related to what was going on in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. The fact that the crowds there flew Russian flags will have really annoyed them, and they know on some level that the weakness that has been displayed and the inability to actually counter the Russians in Ukraine, displayed by the European powers and the US, has shown to many of these officer corps rebellious types that have taken power in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, that the French imperialists can't get it up anymore, to be crude. That they are unable to stop these rebellions, and these rebellions are founded on popular support. And therefore, that is why the revolutionary nationalist junta in Niger has been able to survive thus far is because it is solidly supported by the masses, and the French imperialists can't risk an open war because they don't have the capability to fight it. Again, let's go back to the famous statement of Mao. Why are the imperialists paper tigers? Why does Mao say they are paper tigers? He says it because their link to their own masses is very, very tenuous. And Macron rightly fears that if he asked the French to die en masse for the preservation of their neo-colonial possessions in Africa, he wouldn't get a very good response. He'd get an even less good response if he told the French that they had to go and die by the hundreds of thousands in Ukraine, which they would if Macron was mad enough to send them. But even Olaf Scholz has choked on this particular demand because they all know that they couldn't sustain a war with the Russians, and they all know that the Americans wouldn't back them. And this is why you can ignore the harumphing of the Europeans. Without the US imperialists, there is no NATO. And the Europeans don't have the industrial capacity or the political capacity to keep a war against Russia going for more than a few days. So, and they all know it as well, which is why Macron ended up looking like an idiot pissing in the wind. Right. Steve says, during the disastrous local election campaign, they fell over themselves to say the communists were the first to condemn Putin for his invasion. Well, what a pathetic gang of slime bags they really are. Steve adds to the point there, if Russia withdrew, then you only have to look at what's happening in Gaza now. The people of Donbass and Crimea certainly don't support the call for Russian troops to leave. Yeah. And the communists, so-called communists, have completely ignored the desires of the working class in Donbass and Crimea. Ian says they are fakes. All anti-imperialists have to, by definition, support Russia. I can only conclude they're either not anti-imperialist or plain confused. Some of them are confused. Some of them are just, again, social chauvinists, to use Lenin's phrase. Yes, Jenny, it is exhausting to be always right. Steve answers a question I posed and says that the CPB did have a relationship with the KPRF even after the SMO, but it turned against the party, and I was told that they were really Russian nationalists. I was told not to use them as a source. Well, the thing is, the rebirth of revolutionary tradition in Russia was always going to have a national component to it, because the nation had been essentially almost destroyed when it was sold by the compradors, or the compradors attempted to sell it to US imperialism. So there's going to be elements in the propaganda of the KPRF, and I don't always agree with what the KPRF says, but you have to understand why they talk about defense of the nation, etc. It's because the Russian nation almost got completely eviscerated by the imperialists and their local agents. It nearly ended up in as bad a state as the Baltic states did, given that they are run by local compradors. So to not understand that, you have to either be very poorly read non-Marxist, or just simply an opportunist who's looking to just agree with the Labour Party. Limke says, how can some people from the West deny that Russia is not communist from their obvious propaganda machinery? Well, it is not communist, it's capitalist, friend, but it's not imperialist. All right, where are we now? Dean says, the CPB, are ebbing closer to the Alliance for Wealthy Liberals. That's the AWL, the worst elements of Trotskyism, or at least the most honest. Neither Washington nor Moscow rhetoric, they just need spontaneous establishment of workers' councils to complete their revisionist collapse. Well, I'm sure they'll come up with that. If you're not familiar with what Dean's referring to there, the organisation that I was a part of years ago used to, they said in Syria and in Libya, spontaneous workers' councils have emerged in Aleppo or in Benghazi. What was this based on? Was there a reference to this? Was there an organisation behind it? No. The best you could find was like one tweet from an anonymous account that could well have been run by like anybody, most likely run by an intelligence agency. And they based half of their policy of being in favour of the overthrow of Gaddafi and Assad on the idea that there was this spontaneous workers' movement from below. Didn't exist. They were lying about it. And if they're prepared to just come out and either endorse a lie or a total fantasy and not actually interrogate at all the conditions on the ground or what communists from these particular countries are saying then these people are frauds and tools of imperialism, whether they realize it or not. And again, I'm talking about myself in the past there, because I was a member of a Trotskyite organization and we were tools of imperialism. We didn't see ourselves that way, but just because you don't see yourself that way doesn't mean that that's not what you are. Right, where are we now? Okay. Philippos Kasapis says the CPB line is inspired by the KKE, which is the biggest communist party in Europe, with a true revolutionary line and huge connection with Labour. Well, the KKE does not have a true revolutionary line. The KKE insists upon the idea that there is a what is it? They call it a pyramid of imperialism. That they are somehow that the Russians are interwoven into the imperialist order, when the actual reality of how the US has treated the Russians since the 90s showed that they weren't incorporated into the imperialist order. The only objective US imperialism had was to essentially destroy all resistance to essentially turning Russia into a neo-colony from which massive profits could be extorted via the hyper-exploitation of Russian resources and labor. And that this necessitated the rule over Russia by a pure comprador regime, by that Navalny or Khodorkovsky or some combination of the two. The KKE have ceased to be a Marxist organization. They have become an organization which is fundamentally Trotskyite and opportunist, which merges together ultra-left sloganeering and right-wing practices. They do not have a correct political line. Their analysis of Russia as being part of an imperialist system is totally wrong. Their analysis of how the Russian economy and state have developed over the last 20 years or so is totally wrong. If Russia is part of the imperialist system, or is an imperialist country competing with the United States for influence, then they're not doing a very good job of it, are they? Given that every time the US made an aggressive move in Ukraine, for instance, over the last 30 years, for many decades until 2014, the Russians watched and did nothing about their own influence being essentially destroyed in Ukraine and replaced with US influence. And also their own influence being diluted and destroyed in given what little influence they had already in the Baltic states. They acted, yes, over Georgia, but that was, again, to avoid having NATO sat right on their border. So the characterization of Russia as an imperialist power is simply a work of fiction. You can't even call really what the Russian oligarchs do with their capital to be capital export, because they're not exporting it to other countries to realize profits on it. They're exporting it to bank accounts and stashing it in property to make sure that they can keep it safe from the Russian state. So the KKE have abandoned Marxism completely. They have abandoned Lenin's analysis of imperialism, and they have embraced an ultra-leftist analysis, which is not just abandoning Marxism and Lenin's analysis, it's abandoned basic empirical observations. So to say that they've got this great correct line is incorrect. They are wrong. And they are selling people in the European Communist movement and the World Communist movement a complete lie, dressed up in left language to cover the opportunism and the cowardice of people like the CPB and the social chauvinists therein. So let's move on now to just briefly look at the CPUSA. I don't want to say too much about this because I've gone on at quite some length about the CPB. One point two points actually I want to make about the CPUSA. CPUSA, from what I can tell, claim to be building some kind of anti-monopolist alliance I believe that this was a line used back in the days of William Z. Foster. And they, of course, the modern version of the CPUSA echo this. But they say in their statement, their policy statement, they're going to build on their alliance against like the ultra right wing and the fascists, etc. Now, what this has boiled down to in reality is essentially an endorsement, a blanket endorsement of the Democratic Party as it stands today, and an endorsement of Biden. And I saw some statements from their official Twitter account recently saying that Biden needs to do more to convince people that he's worth voting for in November, etc. And needs to do more to secure a ceasefire. In other words, what they're calling for is, in actual fact, they're calling for Biden to give them an excuse to say vote Democrat in November. That's what they're calling for. And by insisting upon the fact that fascism in the United States is imminent, it's coming right now, it's coming in the form of Trump. Again, what does that do? First of all, it backs up the narrative of the Democratic Party, which is the party of, Wall Street, the party of all the most major sections of the bourgeois. The Republican Party is that party as well, but principally the biggest bourgeois have been behind the Democratic Party for at least a couple of election cycles now. They may swing back behind the Republicans again. This is how these things go. But the CPUSA, by playing into this farce and essentially going out and lying to people that the Democratic Party represents a vote against fascism or a vote for some kind of anti-monopoly alliance, is a complete lie. The Democratic Party rammed through the biggest single act of strike breaking that I can remember in the United States since Reagan did in the air traffic controllers in, I believe, was it 84 or earlier than that, in the early 1980s. Biden broke a railroad strike on behalf of the railroad monopolies. And that's the president that you're going to tell your members to vote for? That's the party you're going to tell your members to vote for? CPUSA? What part of the anti-monopoly alliance is that playing? You know, some paltry verbal concession from Biden saying he's going to help pass the PRO Act or something like that. Does that make up for the single biggest act of strike breaking in recent US history? Never mind, this is before we even get to Biden, of course, overseeing the genocide in Gaza. And if you believe the revelations that even the New York Post was reporting on today, from Aaron Bushnell, the late Aaron Bushnell, who's self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy, that he was a guy who actually worked in Air Force intelligence and had become familiar with certain evidence that showed that U.S. special forces were operating in Israel, in occupied Palestine directly. So the Biden administration, not just funding and arming a genocide, but directly having forces participating in it. And the CPUSA is going to tell you to vote for this party in the name of anti-fascism. That's insane. That's such a gigantic piece of opportunism. And again, it comes back to social chauvinism. And why is it that social democrats in the imperialist countries always end up being social chauvinists? This is an interesting question. Because if you're actually a sincere social democrat, you can't remain a social democrat. Because if you actually want to analyze what is good for the working class, you have to come to the conclusion that the capitalist systems in these countries are fundamentally rotting away. They can no longer realize profit on the employment of labor in the home country, and therefore they have to export capital to areas that can be hyper-exploited outside of that country. So you either have to draw that conclusion and become a communist and an anti-imperialist, or you become a social chauvinist, which is you carry on pretending that the system can be reformed, and you carry on pretending that we can get concessions out of the ruling class. But you must know, if you've read any amount of Lenin at all, that those concessions can only be fueled by what? By the extraction of super profits from oppressed areas of the world that are hyper-exploited by the US imperialists. And that is how, of course, the concessions to the British working class and the US working class were in part paid for back in the 40s and 50s and early 1960s. And if you're in the CPUSA, what you are essentially doing is calling for Biden or whoever the fuck the Democratic Party nominee is to do a more subtle version of imperialist slaughter so that you can retain plausible deniability whilst telling people to vote for you, vote for the Democratic Party, and then hope to get some concessions when some super profits have been extorted and that the great, grand, glorious era of reform can come back again. This is social chauvinism in action. The CPUSA and the CPB are social chauvinists. They are that way because they are social democrats, and they are dishonest social democrats in that they have at one point, some of them have seen that the reform period was funded by imperialism, but they have chosen to ignore that. They have chosen to gloss over it. They have chosen to pretend that this was all just the product of a reform process that was involved taxing the rich more in this country or in America. This is deception. This is the worst kind of opportunism. And they dress this up in, they dare to dress this up in anti-fascist rhetoric. It's a sick joke. It is a sick joke. They are telling American workers to go and vote for Biden. Biden, who is every bit as bad as Donald Trump, just in slightly different ways, who represents bits of the ruling class that are every bit as repulsive as the bits that are lined up behind Donald Trump. And they're going to try and sell this to you as some kind of progressive, anti-fascist, anti-monopoly alliance. Fuck off. Seriously. It's the only language I can think of for these fake communists and their leaders in the KKE, who I will emphasize again, have abandoned Marxism, have abandoned the Leninist analysis of imperialism, have embraced a combination of ultra-leftism and opportunism. And to answer a question that came into me via email, what would happen if the KKE came into power? They'd end up like Syriza. That's the reality. They may split more than Syriza did, because I think they've got more, there's more people in the KKE who do actually consider themselves revolutionaries, but their leadership would crumble like Syriza's before the combined pressure of the imperialists. They wouldn't be prepared or able to rally the working class any better than Syriza would. And they'd end up crumbling into dust because their theoretical position is weak, and therefore the training of their cadres will be weak. Therefore, their connection with the masses and their ability to mobilize the masses will also be weak. They will be completely unprepared to face the assault that imperialism would rain down upon them if they did come to power, even in a coalition. So they have misled and miseducated their own comrades, and they would mislead the Greek working class down another dead end, just like Syriza did. And that is my judgment on the KKE. All those who disagree, feel free to email me and pose questions. Right. Let's get back to comments. Right. I have a critic here who appears to be from Greece. Okay, right. Well, if we get into that, I'm going to be here all day. So what I propose to do, if you disagree with the comments you've heard here tonight, I would encourage you to email me your critique at the following email address, which is editor@marxengelsinstitute.org. So if you disagree or you want me to read out your critique of what I've said, then email me there and I will address it on a future program. Hello to Dan Kovalik, who's joined us. Biden is not complying with the CPUSA, says Todd. I'm sure that they're at the top of his list, of his in tray. Todd says, war is the most extreme manifestation of fascism, be it in Ukraine or in Palestine. I would say the imperialist war is one of the key sources of fascism. And so therefore, if Biden is engaging in two brutish imperialist wars, then Biden and the Democrats are a source of fascism, as much, if not more, than Trump is potentially. Ian Foster says William Z. Foster would be turning in his grave if he could see what his former party has become. Indeed, he would. Lim K says Russia doesn't have a choice. It's Russian people are being victimized by neo-Nazis in Donbass. That is not imperialistic. Good point. Get back to work. This is Cobra Commander's comment. Biden says to the rail strike before the very rail line itself had a chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio. Excellent point to raise. One of the things the railroad workers in the USA were pointing out was that safety standards on the American railways were collapsing. And again, what does Biden do? Backs up the railroad monopolies. This is who the CPUSA is in an anti-monopoly alliance with. It's a laugh. It's a joke. Back in 2004, says Marius, the CPUSA said, don't hold your nose and vote for John Kerry. Vote for John Kerry with a smile. My God. Isn't it? I mean, but also, I think both the CPUSA and the DSA might as well merge at this stage. They seem to be basically the same organisation. Maybe the DSA is a little bit too militantly anti-working class for the CPUSA, but they seem to be basically drawn from the same layer of like petty bourgeois idiots. Slava says, I know several MLs who are not members of the CPUSA but still suffer from Trump derangement syndrome, thinking he is the face of fascism. I think we got to encourage people to read Rajani Palmdutt's work on fascism and Dimitrov's work on fascism, and see that the Republicans and the Democrats are two bourgeois parties that have both of which have strong fascist potential within them, and fascism comes from the bourgeois as a class, and the bourgeoisie in the United States right now, even though it has pro-fascist dispositions, don't feel that they need to impose fascism at this stage. If Trump is a manifestation of fascism, then Biden is another manifestation of fascism. Because these are both very militant servants of the imperialist order. They just slightly disagree about the priorities. So if you condemn Trump for being a fascist, you have to condemn Biden also. Because if you look at what they actually do, beyond the language games, which are important, as I've written about this week, but look at the actual reality of what Biden does and what Trump does. How would Trump have handled that rail strike any differently than Biden? He wouldn't. How would Trump be handling the Gaza situation? He would be doing the same thing. Probably more enthusiastically and with less hand-wringing. How would Trump handle, now, the Ukraine war? He says he would handle it differently, but how did he handle it when he was actually in office? He provided more arms to Ukraine than Obama did. So again, like, if Trump is a fascist, then Biden is also a fascist. But if that's your analysis, then you need to take a step back and see where fascism comes from. Stop attaching it to what this politician or that politician. Fascism comes from the bourgeois. It represents a need of, in this case, the American ruling class for the total destruction of the organization and the living standards of the American worker. That's the need that the ruling class has when it turns to fascism. So to that extent, Biden and Trump are manifestations of a completely repugnant American ruling class, but they only represent sort of small manifestations, or small or larger manifestations of fascist elements, but they're not fascists themselves, because the need for fascism inside America, domestically, hasn't fully emerged yet. The American state is incredibly authoritarian and is incredibly reactionary and incredibly anti-worker, but that doesn't make it fascist. There's plenty of incredibly reactionary anti-worker state regimes in imperialist countries that aren't fascist yet. We'll know when the fascism hits, trust me. Right, where are we? Hitler was the lesser evil for the German bourgeois in the 1930s, says Vidnosh, and that's completely correct. Marius says the anti-monopoly coalition made sense in the 30s when nearly all of Wall Street was lined up against Roosevelt. The Democrats have been the favored party of Wall Street for decades. Yeah, and this is, to pick up on Marius's point, this is what happens when you abstract a slogan from historical and economic developments. Like, you could make the argument, as the CPUSA did in the 30s, that you could go into an alliance with a bourgeois leader like Roosevelt, who had his own motivations, who was prepared to make significant concessions to the working class in order to, as he saw it, secure the stability of the system. So yeah, that was an argument that could be made back then. It's not an argument you can make now. It's not. I mean, as Marius said, like the Wall Street gang actually planned to coup out Roosevelt and wanted to get rid of him and stage a military coup in the USA. These days, all the significant, biggest elements, most powerful elements in the ruling class have been behind the Democratic Party since, well, it was kind of split under George W. Bush, I think, but they've been solidly behind the Democrats since Clinton. They've not been at all hostile to the Democrats since the Clinton era. Where are we now? 6-hour live stream Q&A incoming, says Jenny. Yeah, I may need some rocket fuel for that one. Yeah, there's as Dan Lindstrom says, there's essays by my comrade Jyoti Bra on the World Anti-Imperialist Platform site, which you can find, which go thoroughly into a critique of the KKE and its abandonment of Marxism. So if you want more about that, I'm going to post the link in the description right now. Based Palm Dut, says Jenny. That's correct. CPB said last year it's the only party with a coherent political analysis of sex and gender. Well, even that's incoherent. If you want a thoroughly materialist analysis of the sex and gender question and the identity politics question, my own party, the CPGBML, has an excellent pamphlet on the above questions. Jay says it's been my experience that the DSA and the CPUSA meld into some symbiosis. Yep. Marius says an astonishing number of so-called communists think fascism is merely extreme racism and not an objective outcome of financial capitalism in decay. Yeah, because again, these people don't read, like, or if they do, they don't understand, and that just leads you to. I mean, if you look back on like the way in which the American left since the 50s has responded to various different presidents. I mean, there's I can remember reading things about from like American Maoists saying, "Oh, Nixon's a fascist, Carter's a fascist, Ford's a fascist." Well, maybe old Jerry wasn't around too long to be judged, but Reagan's a fascist, Clinton's probably a fascist. Like, well, okay, well, has it been fascist for that long? You know, this is why I say like the whole edifice of Western Marxism is a complete fucking joke. It's hysterical, petty bourgeois, moralistic nonsense, and we just need to jettison the entire thing. Post-World War II leftism in the imperialist countries has been a disaster because it all turned reactionary, it all turned social democratic, it all turned social chauvinist. And the whole thing needs to be thrown out. Combined, of course, with ultra-leftism, because ultra-leftism and opportunism are intertwined around each other like strands of DNA. Like, again, one of my favorite Stalin quotes is that the ultra-leftist deviation is in reality a rightist one, and the Western leftists just prove that over and over and over again. Like with the alliance of white or wealthy liberals screaming for workers' unity in the Middle East, when the Israeli working class profits directly from the oppression of the Palestinians. Yeah, that's like an ultra-leftist slogan, which is disguising ultra-reactionary content. Same with the Trotskyites and their anti-bureaucratic revolution. Ultra-left sounding slogan, ultra-reactionary content. And what they did in their actual political practice was jump into bed with all of the so-called opposition trends in places like Poland and the Soviet Union and other people's democracies, which included fascists who were all happy to sign up to the slogan of an anti-bureaucratic revolution. And what did it mean? It meant the destruction of the planned economy and the selling off of the state and the destruction of those societies that the Trotskyites were all on board for. Where are we? Why do the main bourgeois parties still exist as separate entities? Just marginal differences in viewpoints with regard to priorities? They represent slightly different elements within the ruling class. So I'll use the American example, like the current trend now over the last decade or few decades has been that the Democrats represent like the most or a majority perhaps at the moment of the most developed, the biggest and most powerful sections of the American ruling class, mainly behind the Democrats. Not exclusively, they also spread their bets to the Republicans as well. But in more recent years, the Republicans got backed more by small business, sort of upper petty bourgeois types and lower end bourgeois. So like capitalists who have more of their interests active, not in the sphere of imperialism, but are more active in terms of their profits being derived from inside the United States itself. And it's those divisions within ruling classes that often define the boundaries between bourgeois parties. And that's why they're kept on. That and the social control aspect, which is that if they all just merged together, it would look a bit awkward at election time. But it's fundamentally about divisions in the ruling class. AJ Williams says, Wall Street favors Biden over Trump. They do at the moment. That may change, but they do at the moment. CIA leftism sucks, says Jenny, and that's very true. Albert asks, what have I missed? Quite a lot, mate. Just catch up. Final thing I wanted to cover tonight, though, was another document which I am going to attempt to share here. Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Wrong link. Hang on. A document that's been put out recently by the Irish Republican Socialist Party on the immigration question. So if you go on that, you can take a look at the document I'm referring to there. I was asked to comment on this by somebody on Twitter today, who I believe is an IRSP supporter, because this short and concise document basically outlines the IRSP's analysis of the immigration question in both sides of the false partition of Ireland, stemming out of the anti-immigration riots that took place in Dublin a few months back. And the IRSP went out and did a consultation, I think, with working class communities, and they came back with this with this position paper, which apparently has been accused of being racist by various elements on the Irish left. And I've read through it, and I can't see what would possibly be racist about it. In my opinion, the IRSP in this document make a good point, which is that they say that their position seems to be, if I have read this correctly, that the question of like border control can only be properly talked about and properly implemented under a situation where, first of all, you have the reunification of Ireland, where the national question in Ireland is resolved. I mean, that's an eminently sensible position, where the British occupation of the North is removed, but also that you have a workers' republic. And I think that that's also an eminently sensible position, because I think that what the IRSP paper recognises, which I think is necessary for all of us to recognise, is that these arguments that are fuelled by the bourgeois, these arguments about immigration, and you get them in this country, you get them in the United States, you get them in Ireland, draws out only like the most reactionary, clownish politics by design. So you get, as the IRSP correctly note, opportunists, reactionaries, talking about the need to kick out this immigrant group or another, or this immigrant group brings crime, etc. And then they'll ignore the fact that huge amounts of real estate are bought up in Ireland by foreign capitalists. So like the Irish fascists, who, by the way, a lot of them are in groups controlled ultimately from Britain, will go on and about foreigners and ignore the buying up of Irish land and real estate by both Irish landlords and, of course, landowners and property owners from outside of Ireland, or the fact that Ireland barely even has its sovereignty because, of course, it's dominated by foreign capitalists. And if you're going to talk about an immigration policy, well, you can only really talk about an immigration policy that benefits the working class if the working class is ruling in a unified Ireland under a regime of a workers' republic. And I think that's the correct position, and I think for the Irish to take, and I think you have to be honest with the working class in the way that you present this question, which is that, I mean, for Ireland it's different because Ireland's not an imperialist country. It's a country which is still subjected to imperialism. But to use our example as Britain being an imperialist country, we can't go around and tell the working class that the making demands about immigration to the ruling class is going to bring anything, because the ruling class need that vast wave of migration coming out both legally and illegally into Britain. Legally, in terms of the fact that the British ruling class acts as like they have a constant vacuum system on to vacuum up labour from other parts of the world and deposit it in Britain, because without that, then key British organisations such as the health service would collapse, because Britain is losing doctors and nurses and other medical personnel trained in this country. They're losing them to Australia, Canada and New Zealand, where pay is better, because the pay is being run down here. And in response, the British ruling class, because they know that if they just let the health service collapse, it would trigger a revolt, they go out and replace them by recruiting from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Philippines and other areas. So the British ruling class then hoover up all of this labour for these professions that need to be in with skill gaps in them or job positions in them that need to be filled, and bring them in and put them on worse terms and conditions. And they're not going to stop doing that, by the way. You can't seriously make demands on immigration to the British ruling class right now under this stage of capitalism, because none of them will be fulfilled. And you will be lying to the working class that you can reform this system. Because we've reached the stage now where without this consistent trend of immigration, without the ability to exploit immigrant labour, both in these professions where they're brought in legally, and with this whole controversy that we've got in Britain at the moment about, oh, stop the boat, stop the illegal labour. The illegal labour, as they put it, is coming here because there is a massive demand for it on behalf of the employers, especially in the agricultural sector and in other areas of the economy where the employers require labour that can be hyper exploited. That's why the so-called illegal labour is coming here in relatively large numbers, because the work's here, because the labour demand is here. They're not coming here to sit on benefits, which is what the Dumbo reactionaries want people to believe. They're coming here because the employers have jobs that need to be filled, and they're not going to employ British nationals to do them because they barely even want to pay minimum wage to do it. That is especially true in agriculture, and that's been true in British agriculture for decades now. So the Irish question is a little bit different, because obviously they're not an imperialist country, we are. Our responsibility, i.e. the British ruling class and government's responsibility for immiserating people and forcing them from their home countries, means that it's even more morally repugnant upon if we were to, as so-called communists in this country, would go around screaming for immigration restrictions, when it is the British imperialists themselves which uprooted these people from their homes and forced them to flee and forced them to seek up employment elsewhere. So for the Irish, I think it's even more important, because what they need to do is, of course, they need to tell the truth to the Irish working class that the Irish government and the Irish bourgeois have no interest in solving this question whatsoever. Why on earth would you make demands upon them to solve it when, again, they need that cheap labour to work in hyper-exploitable areas of Irish capitalism almost as much as the British ruling class do? So why on earth would you seek to have them enforce an immigration policy which is not going to benefit the Irish working class at all. The truth is that you can only have a decent immigration policy when you actually have working class rule. Until then, you can't have one. You can't have one under this stage of capitalism. Calling upon the ruling class to build a wall or to lock more people up or to deport more people, all you're doing is helping the ruling class sow division in the working class. And you're also being dishonest. You're being dishonest in terms of you're lying to the working class if you're saying that about the possibility of this situation being resolved under capitalism. The situation can only be resolved when the imperialist system is overthrown, when the countries that these people are forced out of can actually have decent, developed, planned economies. Or at least economies that can be run on a more sovereign basis without being crushed by the imperialist system. And it can only be the case that we achieve both socialism in this country or in Ireland or anywhere else if we build an alliance between the working class domestically and the workers and peasants of the overseas countries who are oppressed by imperialism. We don't get that by pandering over immigration and pretending that the capitalist state can put in place anything which is going to benefit the working class in these countries. And I think the IRSP statement, I mean, I'll read the conclusion from it. I think it reaches a fairly sensible conclusion, which is as follows, and I'll quote directly from it. Whether one agrees with the current scale of movement of people into Ireland, a policy on this matter left in the hands of the capitalists to control in their own interests at least has the potential to be used to the detriment of the working class. The only solution to this ultimately is the organisation of the working class to demand control of Ireland's wealth and wealth-producing resources. This has been the call of the recent generations of Irish patriots, through to the heroes of our history, that the workers of Ireland control the resources of Ireland. And then they quote from the democratic programme of the first Dáil. So I know it's perhaps a bit of a cliche saying one solution revolution, but the only solution to this problem is the removal of the capitalists from power, is the assumption of power by the working class over the land and all resources of Ireland or of any country. You cannot pretend that the ruling class has any solutions to the immigration question that are worth engaging in. And any border militarization, any building up of police forces to deport people, to terrorize people, all of that you may try and sell opportunistically to the working class today, as the IRSP correctly point out in their conclusion, will be used against the working class tomorrow. Because that's what, of course, routinely happens in the United States. The militarization of the border, the usage of police agencies against hyper-exploited workers, all of this happens in order to keep labour flexible, to keep the costs of labour down, to have hyper-exploitable pools of labour that can be abused by the capitalist class inside the United States under the constant threat of being deported. That's what the immigration system is used for. So you do not get an advance in class consciousness by lying to the working class and pretending that the current system can be turned to their interest. It cannot. And I think that the IRSP correctly identify that the Irish ruling class are the ones who are happy to see large numbers of migrant labourers come into the country because it aids their profit, their bottom line, basically. But that also that there's no solution to this under the current system. Without resolving the Irish national question and without workers building a workers' republic in Ireland, there can be no solution to any of the problems facing the Irish working class. To pretend that the current Irish, I think many IRSP supporters call it the Irish Free State and the Irish bourgeois, have solutions to these problems would be to act to con the working class. So I think that the paper that the IRSP have adopted, it tells the truth to the working class about why immigration is as it is, and it also tells the truth that you can't have solutions to this problem under the current system. And I think that is a much more proper position to take than pandering to divisive sentiments and pretending that enacting immigration controls has any solution for the working class. It does not. Or going in the other direction and just, waving sort of hippie-ish bumper sticker slogans and saying like, oh, well, immigrants welcome here, everything's fine, and not acknowledging that certain problems are created under this system of decaying capitalism and by continual waves of labour coming into a country, which are going to be used by the ruling class for the purposes of hyper-exploitation, and are going to be used also to try and keep the working class divided from the newer arrivals. And the task of communists is to unite all of the working class together on a basis of a shared program to overthrow the ruling class, not engage in the kind of pandering bullshit that the Social Democrats have done in the past, which is pretending that there can be immigration laws written to suit the interests of the domestic working class. There cannot. Right. Martin asks, are there any formal links between the IRSP and the CPGBML? None that I'm aware of. Though I do hope to interview some of them at some point soon. Right, okay. I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening, because it's been going on for about an hour and a half now. Again, I see there's more questions that have come in, so I'll answer a couple of them. Tusker asks, I tend to see it as Republicans are more backed by industrial capital and Democrats get more backing from financial capital. Your thoughts? I would say that because finance capitalism is undoubtedly the more powerful of the two, then yeah, they are backed by the more powerful wing of the ruling class at the moment. I think industrial capital that is nationally based inside the United States, or more nationally based inside the United States, is backing the Republicans at the moment. And that's why Trump and others started making protectionist noises. And also, let us not forget that even George W. Bush, even though he talked a big free trade game, enacted tariffs on coal or steel back 20 years ago now. So the industrial capitalists, I think, to develop Tusker's point, probably do back the Republicans a little bit more, because for them, the deregulation agenda is particularly important, as is the restrictions on wages, because without that, then being an industrial capitalist in the United States is not as profitable as they want it to be, or as they need it to be. Whereas for financial capital, backing the Democrats, and of course both of them are parties of imperialism, but the financial capital backs the Democrats as they now more reliable vehicle for American imperialism, whereas the Republicans, even though, again, to emphasize, Trump's on board with like 90% of the same imperialist agenda, they have some differences with the Democrats over like the Ukraine question, the Russia question. So yes, I think the way you formulated it makes sense there. Now I'm talking through it in my own mind. Right. Okay. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in and has contributed to the discussion tonight. Again, got questions, follow-up questions or disagreements, email them in to the address I provided. I'll be back again with another one of these tomorrow night. But until then, thank you for joining me, and I will now throw you back over to some musical accompaniment.
Dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput,